All right, so I wanted to comment on what this doctor is saying here on this interview with this individual. So they're talking about Limitless. I just watched the first episode. It's very good. I may maybe give some spoilers here, so turn this thing off if you don't want to know some things. But I wanted to comment on some of her tips, and specifically not so much comment on them because I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor. But really, what I want to do is I want to add an additional tip concerning the spiritual realm when it comes specifically to Christian positive thinking. So she talks about positive thinking and all these different thoughts and how you power through that. And I want to bring in some biblical thoughts concerning positive thinking that can help us. And specifically, positive thinking as it relates to the prospect of death. I share a little bit of insight there. But let's kind of look at what she says here and go from there.
That's your first question. I think your second question was
about stress in general, how this episode is really going to help people.
Yeah. So here's the thing that I really love about the episode is that I give Chris tools and techniques that anyone can use to address their stress. Different things stress different people out. And one of the first things we need to recognize is, okay, well, what is it that's stressing me out? Am I stressed? Acknowledge that stress. And if you are, figure out what you need to do about it. And some of the tools that I give Chris are, I remind him to breathe. Your body's telling you, oh, there's danger. So your bodily systems say, okay, get ready for that danger. Heart rate increases, all this hormones start coursing through your body in a different way. So sometimes you just need to breathe to slow down the process. Another thing is we have these warring sides of us that tell us negative and positive things. Well, sometimes we need to remind ourselves, no, I'm not a loser. I am up for a challenge, changing the positive self-talk. And also just tools like mindfulness, just being able to still your mind and not judge what you're going through. So those are some tools that many people can use and that people will see in this episode.
And that's what I love about this episode.
Okay, so let me kind of comment on that. So the Bible has some things to say on this. So if you come to the book of Philippians chapter 1, you see Paul in prison, and he's writing to the church at Philippi, and he's sharing some wonderful things that can really help for practical Christian living. And I don't want to comment much on what she says. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor. It seems like she's given some pretty sound advice and some practical tips. And they seem to work for Chris in the episode of Limitless, the first episode. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what could be added. I want to kind of go into the spiritual realm. And the foundation for Christian positive thinking, as I would say, the foundation is what you understand in God's Word. What you understand in God's Word. So let me kind of move this out of the way here, and let's look specifically at chapter 1 here. So without reading the entire thing, what you see is that the Apostle Paul is able to have positive thinking. He's able to think positively, not based upon his own self and belief in his own self, but he's able to think positively because of what God's Word has said, what he understands of God's Word. So this entire section, he kind of talks about 4 different areas in which you can have positive thinking. One area there at the beginning is positive thinking when it relates to anxiety that you have for loved ones. If you keep going, there's some rivalry taking place among Christians, and so there's some positive thinking concerning Christian rivalry and what the outcome of that will be. The rivalry itself is bad and it's no good, but hey, the great thing is that Christ is being preached. So he can think positively even when people are saying bad things about him. Then there's positive thinking as it relates to unwelcome circumstances. Here he is in prison, but he's filled with confidence. He's filled with joy. But there's also positive thinking as it relates to the prospect of death. Let me just kind of read you this here. We'll start at the end of verse 18 here. He says, "Yes, and I will continue to rejoice. For I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage, so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I'm torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is by far better, but it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body." So, let's kind of stop there and comment. Paul is able to look at death with a steady eye. He doesn't fear death. He doesn't. Of course, the Bible speaks of death as being the last enemy, but death is not some Goliath of a beast that Paul fears. Paul's essentially saying, you know what? I mean, the understanding I have is that if I live, well, for to me to live is Christ, but to die is gain. If I live, well, the great thing is that I'm going to continue on doing Christ-centered ministry. But if I die, I'm going to go and be with Christ in a way that I'm not with him here. I go on to be with Christ. I go on to see him personally, see him in a way that I don't see him here, right? So either way, it's Christ-centered ministry here, or it's being with Christ in heaven. How can I lose? Either way, Paul's a winner. So he thinks positively at the prospect of death. What does he say here? He says, "I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage, so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death." You know, it doesn't matter for Paul if he dies or if he lives. Christ is going to be honored in his body. So there's this scene in Limitless in the first episode in which Chris is on top of a very tall building and he has to walk out. He's all harnessed up and everything, but he says earlier on in the film that he's not very keen on heights. And he's there and he's walked out. He's been successful, but then his heart rate is rising as he's there at the end of it. Spoiler alert, by the way. And there's a point where he goes through his exercises, and they seem to work for him. He breathes and stuff like that. And then he thinks positively. And there's a point in which he says, "There's no possible way I'm not going to do this." And he's filled with confidence, and he walks out. Heart rate goes down, and everything's great. If I'm up there, all those techniques, I think, will be helpful. But at the end of the day, I also am not a giant believer in myself. So what will be of greater encouragement to me is the fact that God is sovereign, and the fact that God has a plan, and that if I'm up there and something happens, harness breaks, I fall out, I collapse, whatever, I fall off, I die, well, what does Paul say about the prospect of death? Well, he says, hey, if I survive, well, it's Christ-centered ministry for me here. Well, if I die, though, I go on to be with Christ. Okay, so with full courage now, so as now as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. So the confidence comes by God's word. So if I'm up there and I'm in a panic, sure, will I maybe do some breathing techniques? Yeah. Will I meditate on God's word? I wouldn't be emptying my mind, but I would probably meditate on God's word, specifically Philippians chapter 1 here. And I would think to myself, you know what? God is sovereign. He knows exactly what's going to happen. In fact, this is his plan. This is God's will. If I die, I die. I go to be with Christ. If I live, well, it's Christ-centered ministry. So I can be confident, I can think positively, because Christ is the one that holds the reins. So I just wanted to add that. These are great tips. I'm going to put them in my tool belt for people. But there's an additional one. There's the spiritual side. Trusting in God and facing death with courage. Knowing that if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, it's Christ-centered ministry for you now, here, if you live, or you go on to be with Christ if you die. So that right there is a foundation for Christian positive thinking. So take some of the steps that she says, but also add some of that additional spiritual insight. Well, hopefully you have been blessed by this. Thank you so much, and God bless you in the way.